Bully tries to slap nurse. Big mistake. She broke his nose instantly. Raven Kelly moved through the halls of St. Anthony Memorial Hospital like a shadow, her small frame barely making a sound on the polished linoleum floors. Standing just over 5 feet tall with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and wearing scrubs that seemed too large for her slight build, she had the kind of presence that made people look right through her. Her voice was soft, her manner deferential, and her tendency to avoid confrontation had earned her a reputation among the medical staff as someone who wouldn't cause trouble. St. Anthony sat on the outskirts of Denver, a mid-sized facility that served the working-class neighborhoods of eastern Colorado. The hospital buzzed with constant activity, ambulances arriving at all hours, families crowding the waiting rooms, medical staff rushing between emergencies with the practiced urgency that kept people alive. Raven worked the night shift in the emergency department, taking vital signs and assisting doctors with procedures that ranged from routine to life-threatening. She'd been at St. Anthony for 7 months, transferred from a hospital in Seattle after what her personnel file diplomatically called personal circumstances. The other nurses knew better than to ask questions about why someone would leave a prestigious urban hospital for a smaller facility in the suburbs, and Raven preferred it that way. But Dr. Chad Morrison had other plans for her quiet existence. Morrison stood 6'3" with the kind of commanding presence that made people step aside in hospital corridors. His sandy hair was always perfectly styled, his lab coat crisp and white, and his green eyes held the arrogant confidence of someone who'd never been told no. As the emergency department's senior resident, he wielded his authority like a weapon, using medical hierarchy to crush anyone who challenged his ego. 2 other residents followed Morrison like disciples eager for approval. Dr. Blake Hutchins was tall and angular with nervous energy, constantly seeking Morrison's validation through cruel jokes and casual cruelty. Dr. Travis Kowalski was broader and more physically imposing, using his size to intimidate nurses and junior staff who questioned his orders. The other emergency staff, nurses like Janet Rodriguez and Beth Sullivan, orderlies like Mike Thompson and Danny Walsh, had learned to keep their heads down when Morrison was making rounds. Everyone knew he had connections in administration, family money, and the kind of influence that could make careers or destroy them. What none of them knew was that Raven Kelly had spent 4 years training in Krav Maga and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at an elite self-defense academy in Seattle. The quiet nurse who took orders without complaint had once been training to become an instructor herself, learning to neutralize attackers with lethal efficiency. Her small hands, which they saw as weak, had been conditioned to strike through boards and disable opponents twice her size. But that was before the incident that had driven her from Seattle, before she'd learned that sometimes defending yourself came at costs too high to bear. The harassment started during Raven's 2nd week at St. Anthony. She was checking on a patient in Trauma Bay 3 when Morrison appeared with his entourage, all 3 men sweeping in like they owned the place. Nurse ... Morrison paused, pretending to check her name tag. Kelly, is it? What's the patient's status? Stable vitals, responding well to treatment, Raven replied professionally. Responding well. Morrison moved closer, invading her personal space in a way that made her want to step back. Define well for those of us who actually went to medical school, Blake snickered while Travis cracked his knuckles. Around the trauma bay, other staff members found sudden interest in their clipboards and computer screens. Blood pressure 120/80, heart rate steady at 72, oxygen saturation at 98%, Raven recited. And you consider that responding well? Morrison's tone suggested she'd made some fundamental error. Maybe in Seattle they had different standards, but here we expect precision from our nursing staff. Raven felt heat rise in her cheeks. The patient's numbers were textbook normal, and Morrison knew it. This was about establishing dominance, not medical care. "Of course, Doctor," she said quietly. "Of course, Doctor," Blake repeated in a high-pitched voice meant to mock her. "Maybe next time you could use actual medical terminology instead of dumbing things down for us." The trauma bay filled with uncomfortable tension as Morrison and his crew enjoyed their moment of superiority. Finally, they moved on to terrorize other staff members, leaving Raven alone with her patient and her burning shame. The pattern escalated over the following weeks. Morrison would appear whenever Raven was working with patients, always finding reasons to criticize her competence or question her judgment. He'd assign her to the most difficult cases, then mock her when she struggled with uncooperative patients or complex procedures. The harassment reached new levels during shift changes in the break room. The small space, lined with lockers and equipped with a few tables and chairs, became Morrison's preferred stage for public humiliation. "Well, if it isn't Nurse Sunshine," he'd announce whenever Raven entered, "come to brighten our day with more of that sparkling personality." Blake and Travis would laugh on cue, while other staff members kept their eyes on their coffee cups or locker combinations. Everyone knew getting involved meant becoming Morrison's next target. "I heard about your performance in Trauma 2 yesterday," Morrison continued during one particularly cruel session. "Patient complained about your bedside manner, said you seemed distant and unfriendly. Care to explain why you're making our department look bad?" Raven knew the complaint was fabricated. She'd received nothing but praise from the patient in question. But contradicting Morrison would only make things worse. "I'll work on being more engaging," she said quietly. "You'll work on being more engaging," Travis repeated mockingly. "Maybe you could start by engaging with reality. This is a hospital, not a spa. Patients need competent medical care, not whatever it is you call what you do." The break room erupted in nervous laughter from Blake and Travis, while other nurses studied their hands. Raven gathered her things and left without another word, but she could feel their eyes following her every step. The one bright spot in Raven's hospital existence was Dr. Alex Rivera, a pediatric resident who worked the same night shifts. Unlike Morrison and his crew, Alex treated everyone with genuine respect and kindness. He was soft-spoken with warm brown eyes and a gentle manner that made frightened children trust him immediately. "You okay?" Alex asked one evening, finding Raven restocking supplies in the pediatric ward. "You look like you've had a rough shift." Raven glanced around to make sure they were alone. Getting Alex involved in her problems with Morrison would only create more complications. "Just tired," she said. "Tired from work or tired from dealing with assholes?" Alex's blunt question surprised her. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean Morrison and his fan club. I've seen how they treat you, and it's not okay." Raven's hands stilled on the supplies she was organizing. "It's fine. I can handle it." "Can you? Because from where I sit, it looks like they're trying to push you out." Alex moved closer, lowering his voice. "I've seen Morrison do this before. He picks someone, makes their life miserable until they transfer or quit." "Why are you telling me this?" Alex hesitated. "Because you're a good nurse, and because you deserve better than being someone's punching bag." Their eyes met for a moment, and Raven felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the hospital's heating system. But then footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Alex quickly moved away as the night supervisor made her rounds. That weekend, for the first time since leaving Seattle, Raven drove to a martial arts academy on the other side of Denver. The place was smaller than her old training facility, but the familiar smell of mats and determination brought back memories of a time when she'd felt powerful instead of helpless. "Can I help you?" The instructor was a compact woman with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much. "I used to train," Raven said, "looking to get back into it." "What style?" "Krav Maga, some BJJ." The instructor studied Raven's slight frame with professional assessment. "You don't look like the type." "That's the point," Raven replied. An hour later, she was flowing through combinations that her body remembered even after months of disuse. Punches, kicks, grappling techniques designed to neutralize larger, stronger attackers. Each movement reminded her of who she used to be before she'd decided that violence only led to more violence. Monday night brought the incident that would change everything at St. Anthony Memorial. Morrison was having what he called a consultation in Trauma Bay 5, really just an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority over the nursing staff, while an unconscious patient served as a prop. "As you can see," Morrison was explaining to Blake and Travis, "proper patient assessment requires more than just taking vital signs. It requires actually understanding what those numbers mean." Raven was monitoring the patient's IV drip when Morrison's lecture turned personal. "Take our friend Nurse Kelly here," he continued. "She dutifully records blood pressure and heart rate like a good little robot. But ask her to interpret those readings in context, and you get blank stares." Maybe they didn't cover critical thinking in whatever community college nursing program she attended, Blake suggested. "Community college?" Travis laughed. "I was thinking more like online courses. Certificate in 6 weeks, no experience required." Around the trauma bay, other staff members watched in uncomfortable silence. This was worse than Morrison's usual harassment. This was character assassination performed in front of colleagues and patients. "Actually," Alex Rivera's voice cut across the cruel laughter, "Nurse Kelly graduated from the University of Washington's nursing program, which is consistently ranked in the top 5 nationally." Everyone turned to see Alex standing in the trauma bay entrance, his usual gentle expression replaced by something harder. Morrison's face flushed red. "Dr. Rivera, I don't recall asking for your input. And I don't recall anyone asking for your opinion on nursing education," Alex replied evenly. "Maybe we could focus on actual patient care instead of attacking colleagues." The trauma bay went dead silent. Challenging Morrison publicly was career suicide, and everyone knew it. But Alex stood his ground, meeting the senior resident's furious gaze without flinching. "Dr. Rivera," Morrison said slowly, "I think you're overstepping your bounds." "I think you're overstepping yours." Morrison's face went from red to purple. Being challenged by a pediatric resident in front of his followers was the kind of humiliation that would spread through the hospital like wildfire. "Blake, Travis," Morrison said without taking his eyes off Alex, "I think Dr. Rivera needs a reminder about hospital hierarchy. Maybe he'd benefit from some education about knowing his place." Blake and Travis moved to flank Alex, who suddenly looked much smaller, surrounded by 3 larger men. Raven watched from beside her patient's bed, torn between gratitude for Alex's defense and terror at what Morrison might do to retaliate. "You know what?" Morrison continued, his voice taking on the cruel edge that everyone in the emergency department had learned to fear. "I think both of you need to learn some respect. Nurse Kelly, come here." "I'm monitoring the patient," Raven said. "The patient is stable. Come here, now." Raven reluctantly moved away from the bedside, acutely aware that every person in the trauma bay was watching. Morrison positioned himself between her and Alex, creating a triangle that felt like a trap. "Here's what's going to happen," Morrison announced loudly enough for people in adjacent bays to hear. "Since Dr. Rivera seems so concerned about Nurse Kelly's competence, they're going to work together on a special project. Double shifts, weekend coverage, every difficult case that comes through these doors." Blake grinned with anticipation, while Travis cracked his knuckles. This was more than punishment. This was Morrison setting up both Alex and Raven for failure, while publicly humiliating them in the process. "Dr. Morrison," Alex began. That's not what, Doctor? Rivera, fair, professional, too bad. Maybe you should have thought about that before questioning my judgment in front of my staff. Morrison stepped closer to Alex, using his height advantage to loom over the smaller man. And maybe Nurse Kelly should have thought about that before making googly eyes at residents instead of focusing on her job. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Around the trauma bay, staff members exchanged glances, some shocked, others excited by the drama. This was exactly the kind of gossip that would destroy both their reputations. That's not true, Raven said firmly. Isn't it? Morrison turned his attention back to her, his green eyes cold with malice. Everyone's noticed how you light up whenever Dr. Rivera's around, how you find excuses to work near pediatrics, how you— Stop, Alex interrupted, stepping between Morrison and Raven. Whatever issues you have with me, leave her out of it. Morrison's smile was razor-sharp. How noble, the pediatric resident defending his girlfriend's honor. That's when he made his fatal mistake. Drunk on his own power and the attention of his audience, Morrison drew back his hand and aimed a vicious slap at Alex's face. But Raven Kelly was faster. Her hand shot up like a striking cobra, catching Morrison's wrist in an iron grip just inches from Alex's cheek. The senior resident's eyes went wide with shock as he found himself completely immobilized by someone he dismissed as weak and helpless. "Let go of me," Morrison snarled, trying to pull free. "No," Raven said simply. The word hung in the trauma bay like a thunderclap. For 7 months, Morrison had terrorized staff who were afraid to fight back, building his reputation on the assumption that medical professionals would never resort to violence. He'd never encountered someone who understood that sometimes violence was the only language bullies understood. Morrison tried to swing his free hand at Raven's face, but she was already moving. Using his own momentum against him, she pivoted and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with surgical precision. Morrison doubled over with a gasp, the air rushing out of his lungs. Blake, seeing his mentor crumple, lunged forward with clumsy aggression. Raven sidestepped his charge and swept his legs, sending him crashing into a medical cart. Supplies scattered across the floor as Blake went down hard. Travis, bigger and potentially more dangerous, tried to grab Raven from behind, but she'd trained against larger opponents for years. She dropped her center of gravity, grabbed his wrist, and used a textbook judo throw to send him flying over her shoulder. Travis hit the floor with enough force to rattle equipment on nearby shelves. The entire confrontation had taken less than 10 seconds. Morrison was struggling to breathe, bent over with his hands on his knees. Blake was groaning among scattered medical supplies. Travis lay on his back, staring at the ceiling with a dazed expression. Around the trauma bay, staff members stood frozen in amazement. Nurses who'd endured months of Morrison's abuse were seeing their tormentor laid low by the person they'd thought was the weakest among them. But Morrison wasn't finished. Humiliated in front of everyone and desperate to salvage his authority, he straightened up with murder in his eyes. "You crazy bitch," he snarled, raising his hand again. "I'll have you arrested for assault." This time he wasn't aiming a slap. This time his fist was clenched and aimed at Raven's face with the full force of his rage behind it. Raven saw the punch coming from a mile away, wild, emotional, thrown by someone who'd never been in a real fight. She slipped inside his guard like water, her own fist traveling in a short, perfect arc that caught Morrison square on the nose. The cartilage crunched audibly under her knuckles. Blood exploded across Morrison's face as he staggered backward, both hands flying to his shattered nose. The trauma bay filled with gasps and exclamations as the senior resident who'd terrorized them all stood there bleeding and broken. "My nose!" Morrison screamed, blood streaming between his fingers. "You broke my fucking nose!" Raven stood calmly in the center of the chaos, her scrubs unmarked and her breathing steady. This was the moment she'd been trained for, The split second when you decided whether to press your advantage or show mercy. Morrison was completely defenseless, blood blinding him and pain overwhelming his ability to think clearly. One more strike would put him on the floor permanently, would send a message that no one would ever forget. Instead, Raven reached for a box of gauze from a nearby supply cabinet. "Here," she said, offering it to Morrison. "Apply pressure to stop the bleeding." Morrison stared at her through the blood, his face cycling through pain, rage, and something that might have been fear. "You're finished," he gasped. "I'll have your license. I'll make sure you never work in medicine again." "No, you won't," Alex said quietly from behind him. Everyone turned to see Alex holding up his phone, its screen showing a video recording. "I got everything." Morrison throwing the first punch, Raven defending herself, the months of documented abuse that led up to this moment. The color drained from Morrison's face despite the blood. In today's world of social media and viral videos, being caught on camera attacking a colleague would end his career before it really started. "That's not," Morrison began. "That's exactly what happened." Janet Rodriguez spoke up from the trauma bay entrance. "I saw Dr. Morrison attack Nurse Kelly. I saw her defend herself." "We all saw it," Beth Sullivan added, moving to stand beside Janet. Months of harassment finally escalated to physical violence. One by one, the other staff members found their voices. Nurses who'd been afraid to speak up for months suddenly felt safe enough to describe their own encounters with Morrison's cruelty. Orderlies shared stories of verbal abuse and professional sabotage. Even some of the doctors who'd witnessed Morrison's behavior joined the chorus of accusation. Morrison looked around desperately, seeking support, but found only hostile faces. Even Blake and Travis, still picking themselves up from the floor, seemed to be reconsidering their loyalty. "This is mutiny," Morrison said weakly. "This is justice," Raven replied calmly. Dr. Patricia Chen, the emergency department chief, chose that moment to appear in the trauma bay entrance. She took in the scene, Morrison bleeding and disheveled, Blake and Travis on the floor, Alex holding his phone, and Raven standing calmly in the center of it all. "What happened here?" Dr. Chen demanded. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of statements, video reviews, and administrative damage control. Alex's recording told the story clearly, months of escalating harassment culminating in Morrison's physical attack on Raven. The other staff members' testimonies painted a picture of systematic abuse that had created a toxic work environment. By morning, Morrison was suspended pending investigation. Blake and Travis were transferred to different departments. The emergency staff, who'd lived in fear for months, finally felt free to do their jobs without constant intimidation. As the night shift ended, colleagues approached Raven with new respect and no small amount of awe. "Never saw that coming," Mike Thompson said with admiration. "Guy had it coming for months." "Where'd you learn to fight like that?" Danny Walsh asked. "Seattle," Raven replied simply, which was true enough, but it was Alex's approach that mattered most. He found her at the nurse's station as she was finishing her charting, his expression mixing gratitude with curiosity. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For standing up for me, for standing up for all of us." Alex paused. "And for showing Morrison that there are consequences for being a bully." Raven looked up from her charts. "You stood up for me first. That took courage." "Maybe we could get coffee sometime," Alex asked. "When we're not dealing with workplace drama and broken noses?" Raven smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn since arriving at St. Anthony. "I'd like that." The following weeks brought dramatic changes to the emergency department. With Morrison gone, the atmosphere of fear and intimidation began to lift. Staff members who'd been walking on eggshells found their confidence again. Patient care improved when nurses and doctors could focus on healing instead of surviving workplace abuse. Dr. Chen, impressed by how Raven had handled the situation and aware that the hospital had nearly faced a massive lawsuit over Morrison's behavior, offered her a promotion to charge nurse. Alex received a commendation for his courage in documenting the incident and supporting a colleague under attack. Most importantly, the emergency department developed a new culture of mutual respect. The casual cruelty that had infected St. Anthony's medical hierarchy began to fade, replaced by the kind of collaborative environment that actually saved lives. One evening, exactly 1 month after the confrontation, Raven found Alex waiting by the nurse's station as their shift ended. "Ready for that coffee?" he asked. "I thought you'd forgotten," Raven replied. "Never. I just wanted to make sure Morrison was really gone before we started anything." As they walked through the hospital corridors together, Raven reflected on how much had changed. She'd come to Denver trying to escape her past, to prove she could solve problems without violence. Instead, she'd learned that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in avoiding conflict, but in choosing when and how to engage it. The old Raven would have transferred to another hospital rather than fight back, would have found a new job and hoped the next environment would be different. But Alex had been right. She deserved better than being someone's punching bag. Walking out into the Colorado dawn with Alex beside her, Raven understood that she hadn't really changed at all. She'd simply remembered who she was, not a victim or a warrior, but a healer who could protect those who needed protection and stand firm against those who confused power with strength. Behind them, St. Anthony Memorial hummed with the sounds of medical professionals working together to save lives. And in that sound, Raven heard something she'd been searching for since leaving Seattle: the quiet satisfaction of making a place better by refusing to let cruelty go unchecked. The mouse was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that true healing sometimes required breaking things that were already poisoned, that real strength meant knowing when to fight and when to forgive, and that sometimes the greatest victory was showing bullies that their victims could bite back.